Hey heroes, and welcome to another incredible episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's story begins with the Rosses, a family with a proud military tradition dating back at least as far as the Civil War. For example, after General Peter Ross was killed by foreign spies, his daughter Elisabeth trained extensively to become a counter-espionage agent and worked for the FBI. In 1941, under the codename X-13, she operated and guarded the Curio Shop, which served as a public front for the US government's Operation Rebirth, the project that turned Steve Rogers into Captain America. In the late 1940s, she also operated as the masked hero Golden Girl, alongside Rogers' post-war replacement Jeffrey Mace, who she later married. But today we aren't focusing on Golden Girl, but her nephew, Thaddeus Ross. Now, I will note that due to the nature of Marvel's sliding timeline, exactly when Thaddeus was born is something that changes from story to story. His father, Alexander, was a military man who spent most of his time away from home, and so Thaddeus was largely raised by his mother, Elisabeth, on their farmhouse in West New Hampshire. She told Thaddeus about his father's career and read him bedtime stories of military valor, leading to him developing a keen interest in the army. Meanwhile, she was sometimes kept company by another man, one Mr. Garvin. With Alexander absent, Garvin served as a surrogate father figure for Thaddeus, teaching him how to throw a baseball and build a fire. But Thaddeus later resented both his mother and Garvin when he learned of their affair. In the meantime, Thaddeus also had a group of friends his own age, notably a boy named Henry. When the boys were young, Henry's father, on his way back from war, borrowed a plane from the National Guard station to get home earlier and surprise his family. However, something went wrong with the engine and the plane went down. Traumatized by the experience, Henry abandoned his own dream of becoming a pilot. Thaddeus, however, elected to do it for him and began studying aviation, learning to fly a crop duster by the time he was 10 years old. At 13, he did his first aerial show and continued performing over the next 3 years. Then, when he was 16, he got into a plane crash himself, and although the carnival doctor pronounced him dead on the scene, he awakened in the ambulance with a broken back. He was told that he would never walk again, but after spending the better part of a year in a full-body cast, he eventually proved them wrong, leaving him with a disdain for anybody who claimed to be a doctor. In addition to aviation, Thaddeus Ross also spent much of his childhood studying military history. As a young adult, he enlisted and attended the West Point Military Academy, where he graduated at the top of his class. While there, he met and married Karen Lee, the daughter of a commanding officer. He quickly reached the rank of captain, but Ross longed to prove himself in combat like his ancestors before him. He soon got the chance when he bravely led his troops into battle, who gave him the nickname Thunderbolt. Originally, that took place in the Pacific during World War II, but naturally the sliding timeline means this is no longer the case in modern continuity. I really ought to discuss the actual mechanics of the sliding timeline someday. Be sure to remind me about that in the comments. In any event, by the time he returned home, Thunderbolt Ross had attained the rank of Major. However, without a war to fight, he found himself growing restless and unsatisfied. He kept his wife close, not wanting to repeat his father's mistakes, and soon had a child of his own, Elisabeth Ross. For those keeping track between Thunderbolt's aunt, mother, and daughter, we now have 3 Betty Rosses in the family. But for the rest of the video, we'll only be concerned with his daughter. While Betty was still an infant, her father was involved in more missions and more wars. He was often unconcerned with why he was fighting, but continued to distinguish himself in combat. He spent some time in the Special Forces, during which he was no stranger to the unusual. He had several encounters with Howard Stark, and on one occasion was recruited to help Stark free an alien android called a Rigelian Recorder from a group of Greys that were running a casino in Las Vegas. That mission also involved the likes of FBI agent Jimmy Woo and the CIA's Dum Dum Dugan. On another occasion, Ross was sent to lead a team of men in retrieving an artifact called the Orkosk Eye. Unbeknownst to Ross, one of his soldiers, a man named Barlow, had been instructed to test the mystical properties of the eye by ensuring that it latched on to one of his comrades, transforming the person it touched into a demonic monster. Of course, it didn't take Ross long to realize that Barlow had been given these orders when he refused to risk damaging the artifact and insisted on bringing it back. Although in the end, Barlow was also killed by the monster, leaving Ross as the mission's sole survivor. After killing the monster with a machine gun, Thunderbolt Ross crushed the Orkosk Eye, ensuring that nobody else would suffer the same fate as his men. Upon returning to the United States, he exposed the commanding officer who'd placed Barlow on his squad, Brigadier Nelson, leading to Nelson's arrest. Meanwhile, the military was still interested in pursuing experimental and exotic weapons, and having proven himself able to make sound judgments regarding such matters, Ross was approached to take Nelson's position. Ross agreed, provided the armament they developed was something they had full control over. At one point, he was stationed at a nuclear research facility in Los Alamos, where he met an atomic physicist named Brian Banner. While Ross actually respected Dr. Banner, behind the scenes, Brian was a deeply disturbed man, who was terribly abusive to both his wife, Rebecca, and their young son, Bruce. When Rebecca tried to take Bruce and leave, Brian killed her and intimidated his son into silence, but was ultimately arrested and sent to a psychiatric hospital in California. Bruce was entrusted to the care of his aunt, Susan, and soon began developing a separate personality that expressed his hidden feelings and desires. In the midst of that, when he wasn't fighting overseas, Thaddeus Ross ensured that he remained close to his own family, at least physically. Emotionally was another story, as Betty, despite her best efforts to please her father, was never the son or the soldier that he wanted. Things only got worse after her mother, Karen, developed terminal cancer and passed away just as Betty was entering adolescence. Thunderbolt threw himself completely into his work, and while Betty tried to stay close to her father, he ultimately sent her off to boarding school, declaring that a military base was no place for a woman. Meanwhile, the armed forces were keeping an eye on Bruce Banner, whose extraordinary intelligence was increasingly evident during his high school years. But then, one night Bruce's other persona, which had grown bitter and angry at the world around him, took control of Bruce's body while he slept and planted a homemade bomb in the boiler room beneath the school. While Bruce realized what happened and disarmed the bomb before it went off, he was subsequently arrested for building it in the first place. Fortunately for Bruce, Thunderbolt Ross took notice of the situation and pulled the strings to ensure that the charges against him were dropped, provided that he and Susan leave town. As it turns out, due to a minor error in calculations, Bruce's bomb was a dud, but if he'd accounted for that mistake, it likely would have been tremendously destructive. As such, Ross suspected that Bruce could grow up to be a valuable weapons designer and offered to have the government fund his education and mental health treatment. Now, I will note that there are inconsistencies regarding what branch of the military Ross worked with and what rank he held at any given time, but at the end of the day, he ultimately became a general in the U.S. Air Force. And with that, he was put in command of the Los Diablos missile base in New Mexico, otherwise known simply as Desert Base. After graduating from boarding school, Betty followed him there and stayed by his side whenever she could, despite his emotional distance. He was also joined by a now Dr. Bruce Banner, but was annoyed by the meek civilian scientist that the boy had grown into. His irritation only grew when Betty seemed to be drawn to Banner's sensitivity and intelligence, as he held out hope that she would marry another military man. Still, Banner was there to oversee the development of his own explosive invention, the Gamma Bomb. And I'm sure many of you are fully aware of what happened next when the bomb was completed and ready for testing. On a dare, teenager Rick Jones drove out into the testing area. Spotting him, Bruce Banner rushed out in an attempt to save his life, while a Russian spy, having infiltrated Desert Base, ensured that the countdown was not delayed as Banner demanded. And so, just as Bruce threw Rick into the safety of a protective trench, the bomb went off, bombarding Banner in deadly gamma rays. Ross was understandably furious about the whole situation. For a moment, he turned his attention towards his daughter, and in that moment, while his back was turned, the civilian scientist he'd been entrusted to watch over had run out onto the testing site and seemingly gotten himself blown up. Of course, Banner soon turned up alive, pulled back to the base by Rick Jones, but that night the world was introduced to what would prove to be one of the mightiest monsters to walk the earth, the Incredible Hulk. It wouldn't be long before Ross got a first-hand look at the creature, and while he considered the Hulk a menace, on some level he couldn't help but envy the destructive power that it possessed. However, he also recognized just how dangerous that level of strength could be when left uncontrolled, and stopping the Hulk quickly became his new obsession. Initially, Banner was able to keep the truth of the Hulk a secret and continued working as Desert Base's chief scientist. However, Ross was suspicious and recruited Air Force Major Glenn Talbot to act as his security chief and launch an investigation. Ross also introduced Talbot to Betty, hoping that she would fall for him instead of Banner. While Bruce was able to keep his secret for a while longer, eventually the truth came out and the world learned that Bruce Banner and the Incredible Hulk were one and the same. Banner became a fugitive and Ross dedicated himself to capturing him, nearly succeeding on a number of occasions. There were also times when the general was forced to admit that the Hulk was the lesser of two menaces, like when a foreign agent named Emil Blonsky used gamma radiation to transform himself into an abomination. When Blonsky defeated the Hulk and captured Betty Ross, Thunderbolt had his men revive Banner so that he could pursue this new enemy. The Hulk succeeded in rescuing Betty, earning him a reprieve from the General. Eventually, with help from Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, Banner gained control over his transformations and Hulk form. In the wake of that, Bruce and Betty pursued their relationship and even got engaged. Wanting more than anything for his daughter to be happy, Thunderbolt Ross agreed to bury the hatchet and gave the marriage his blessing, flying them both to California where Betty was born. However, the ceremony was interrupted when the superintelligent gamma mutate Samuel Stearns, aka the Leader, forcibly transformed Banner back into a savage, rampaging Hulk. To make matters worse, the Leader's henchman, the Rhino, sought to take revenge on the Hulk for an earlier defeat and jumped into the fray. When the dust was settled, the house where Betty grew up was completely demolished, and Thunderbolt Ross had been injured by a piece of falling debris. While he was hospitalized because of this, it wasn't long before Ross was back on his feet and on the job. After that, there was an incident in which Betty was turned into a glass statue after being forced to undergo a full blood transfusion with the silicate supervillain Sandman. To cure her, Ross enlisted the aid of Dr. Leonard Sampson, who used a device of his own design, the Cathexis Ray, to drain gamma energy from the Hulk and use it to restore Betty to normal. Doc Sampson also took some gamma for himself and was endowed with superhuman strength. Not long after that, that, Ross was put in charge of a new military installation, Project Greenskin. Stocked with equipment designed and built by Stark Industries, this facility was the home base for a mobile combat force dubbed the Hulkbusters. Early on, the leader attempted to take control of this base by replacing Ross, Talbot, and others with robots loyal to him, but that scheme was quickly thwarted by the Hulk and Doc Samson. The ultimate goal of Project Greenskin was to imprison the Hulk and investigate potential medical applications of gamma radiation. Of course, Ross was more than happy to eliminate the threat of the Hulk by any means necessary. And while the Hulkbusters had some success in capturing their quarry, they were never able to hold him for long, which led some to question whether the project was worth the tax dollars being invested into it. However, Ross was able to convince a Senate hearing to approve its continued funding. Following this, there was an incident in which the Hulk was seemingly lost in space after another battle with the Rhino. Betty, meanwhile, had finally grown close to Talbot, just as her father wanted, and the two were married while Ross prayed that Banner was truly gone. Of course, the Hulk soon returned, and Ross, in his desperation, made a deal with the Abomination, promising to cure and release him if he was able to capture Banner. Naturally, that didn't work, but it didn't stop Ross from employing a similar strategy in the future. In the meantime, the Hulk fled north into Canada, and Ross got clearance from the Prime Minister to pursue the threat into the Arctic Circle. However, while there, both Ross and the Hulk were abducted by Russian agents. The general conspired with Banner to escape, but once Bruce transformed into the Hulk, he left Ross behind. As a result, Glenn Talbot joined with another Air Force officer, Colonel Jack Armbruster, to mount a rescue. While they succeeded in freeing Ross, Talbot was hit by enemy fire and presumed killed, while Ross and Armbruster escaped. Ross was then forced to deliver the news to Betty, who blamed her father for her husband's death, seriously straining their relationship. In truth, however, Talbot survived and was taken captive by the Russians. In any event, because of Ross's failures, command of Project Greenskin and the Hulkbusters was turned over to Colonel Armbruster. Regardless, the general stuck around and advised the Hulkbusters on a number of missions. He also tearfully reunited with Betty after she'd been through a number of her own harrowing trials and was briefly thought dead. After that, Glenn Talbot seemingly returned, but unbeknownst to Ross and the others, this was actually a Russian agent who impersonated Glenn and attempted to use his position to assassinate the US president. Armbruster foiled this scheme at the last minute, but at the cost of his own life. And while Bruce Banner had been successfully captured shortly before this attack also resulted in the Hulk breaking free once again. This time, when the Hulk tried to escape with Betty, Thunderbolt Ross confronted the monster himself, armed with a 10-ton robot. While the Hulk proved strong enough to topple this opponent, when Betty distracted the monster by begging him to stop, Ross fired a bolt from the suit's Gamma Blaster, knocking the Green Goliath out. In the wake of this, Ross resumed command of Project Greenskin, but Hulkbuster Base was soon attacked by the Devastator, a Russian agent who destroyed most of the facility before being killed in battle with the Hulk. Meanwhile, an autopsy of the man claiming to be Glenn Talbot deduced that he was actually an imposter. And so Ross joined forces with S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Clay Quartermain to rescue the real Talbot from the Devastator's superior, the Gremlin. Talbot was rendered catatonic by the Gremlin during their subsequent escape, but later revived thanks to the combined efforts of Doc Samson and Bruce Banner. Meanwhile, the Project Greenskin facilities were rebuilt and renamed Gamma Base, with a renewed focus on the study of gamma radiation and treatment for those that had been affected by it, while Clay Quartermain stayed on to act as their official liaison with S.H.I.E.L.D. Suffice it to say, subsequent attempts to cure or control the Hulk were not successful for long. During this time, Gamma Base was visited by a psychiatrist, Dr. Carla Sofin, who was secretly the superhuman criminal known as Moonstone, and sought to steal military secrets. Ross stumbled upon Sofin's dual identity during her own clash with the Hulk, though she succeeded in mentally manipulating Ross, forcing him to suffer a nervous breakdown. Doc Samson temporarily took charge of Gamma Base in his stead, but ultimately left with the General to focus on his treatment. Samson brought Ross to a secluded cabin in the Colorado Rockies where he slowly recovered. During this time, having fallen out of love, Betty divorced Glenn Talbot, who subsequently accepted command of Gamma Base. Traumatized by everything he'd been through, Talbot later launched an attack on the Hulk, leading to a battle that resulted in his death when the high-tech war wagon he piloted was destroyed. When Thunderbolt Ross then recovered and returned to active duty, he was hell-bent on stopping the Hulk once and for all. He was unable to secure further funding for Gamma Base or the Hulkbusters, but accepted a new position at the Pentagon as a special advisor on matters related to gamma mutates so that he could continue to argue his case. But then, Banner successfully regained control over the Hulk once again, and the superhero community banded together to petition for a presidential pardon. General Ross was indignant, insisting that the Hulk was still a menace, but his objections went unheeded. Unwilling to let go, Ross decided to make a deal with the devil and sought an alliance with MODOK, the bio-enhanced head of Advanced Idea Mechanics, a subversive organization longtime viewers will have heard mentioned many times before. Working together, Ross and MODOK freed the Abomination from captivity and sent him against Banner. However, by this point, Blonsky had already been traumatized by his own past defeats and was actually afraid of the Hulk. His scheme thwarted, Ross admitted to what he'd done in his attempts to justify his actions to Betty. However, Betty declared that his personal obsession had finally driven him to go against everything he stood for by committing treason against the United States. Having betrayed both his daughter and his country, Thunderbolt Ross was overwhelmed by shame and even considered ending his own life, but found himself unable to pull the trigger, and reasoned that doing so would have been the easy way out. Instead, he stripped himself of his medals and status, and was dishonorably discharged from the military. Behind the scenes, however, any treason charges were never actually filed, in part because Samson argued that his irrational behavior was the result of MODOK's mental control. Nonetheless, Ross disappeared and only sank further into madness, but for what happened next, we'll have to come back in a future video. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like a second part to this story, in which we explore what really happens when someone like General Thunderbolt Ross truly becomes everything that he claimed to hate. For now, let me say thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there is anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!